Mobility Policy Research Program at the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida here in Tampa. His research concentrates on travel behavior, public transportation, travel data analyses, and transportation decision making. Dr. Polzin serves on several Transportation Research Board and APTA committees. He teaches graduate courses on transportation and land use and public transportation here at USF. Dr. Polzin has also published dozens of academic articles, contemporary pieces, editorials, and blog postings. So if you're not already, follow Dr. Polzin. And in 2013, he also co-authored the AASHTO Definitive Resource on Commuting, the Commuting in America. He served on the Hillsborough Area Regional Transit Authority Board of Directors for 13 years and the Hillsborough County MPO Board for 7 years. Dr. Polzin is a civil engineer with a BSCE from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and master's and PhD degrees from Northwestern University. He also worked for several transit agencies, including Chicago RTA, Cleveland GCRTA, and DART in Dallas, before joining the University of South Florida in 1988. And I abbreviated Dr. Polzin's bio to allow plenty of time for his interesting presentation today. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Polzin. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Jody. I appreciate people taking time out of their day to be with us on today for this topic. I want to particularly thank the FDOT folks, Gabe Matthews and the Public Transit Office there for supporting our continued work in exploring transit ridership and travel behavior. And also the project team, Jody Godfried, who you just heard, and Richard Driscoll and Kurt Lehman, who are graduate research assistants and do a lot of legwork for us on this particular topic. I'm going to just touch on a few things today. We're going to go over what's going on with overall travel and some basic demographic and economic characteristics, and then relate those to some travel trends. Then I'm going to specifically explore what's underlying the causes of the ridership change in public transportation, and spend a little bit of time looking at implications going forward, what this might mean, what we do and don't know about it at this point in time, etc. Some of these materials have been shared with both the TRB Executive Committee and the APTA CEO Conference, but since that time earlier this year, we have enriched and added new data as it becomes available. This particular slide is a graphic of kind of the background things that are going on. Population growing at a little under 1%, employment growing considerably over the rate of population growth, a strengthening economy, gas prices up a little this year, but down considerably over earlier in the decade. Registered cars and trucks have grown quite dramatically for the past 3 years. Light vehicle sales bounced up real strong after the recession, a little bit more moderate this year, but still at relatively high levels. Zero vehicle households have been declining as a share of all households quite noticeably as we've recovered from the recession, and we'll talk about that a little bit in some of the detailed slides. The consequence of those economic conditions have contributed to a VMT growth trend. In the past 3 years, we ended calendar year 17 with about a 1.2% national increase in VMT, back to a growth pace that outpaces population quite significantly. The red numbers are the next line, the one that we'll spend quite a bit of attention on. Transit ridership is down for its third consecutive year in what is an accelerating decline. We're looking at end of year numbers and they're still a little bit rough. And again, these are calendar year numbers, not fiscal years. Many agencies use fiscal year data for their local reporting. But we're looking at being down in the neighborhood of 2.6%. APTA data had it down 3.1% through the first 3 quarters of the year. as is the case with most of these numbers, oftentimes they're adjusted for 2 or 3 update cycles after they're first published. So I do treat them as important trending numbers, but understanding that they can be modified as additional data updates occur over the year. Amtrak ridership up about 1.9%, and airline passenger travel up quite strongly, the strongest of all the travel trends, up at 3.5%. The VMT trend over the years in both total VMT and VMT per capita, we'd had a long-term history of upward growth that exceeded population growth, with both growth in overall VMT and VMT per capita. During the early part of the decade, that changed in the last decade. We hit a peak VMT in about '07 and a peak VMT per capita in about 2004. VMT per capita is recovering, but it's not yet at the levels that it was in its all-time peak. But total VMT has increased resumed its upward trend. And I think it's important from a transportation planning and policy perspective to recognize that we had about an 8-year reprieve there where VMT was down, and a lot of folks were appreciative of that because the upward trend would have really clobbered the capacity of our systems. But it also created some expectations that we'd seen peak VMT, etc. And obviously that's not the case, as VMT has been ramping back up again at levels that certainly were surprising to a lot of folks who didn't anticipate that strong recovery. If you look at the longer term trend of transit ridership, the blue line is total transit ridership. Its low point was in the early 70s, bounced down again in the mid 90s, and has been generally in an upward trend with some fluctuation since then. Up until about 3 or 4 years ago, where we see some softening in that. Its peak in about 2013, 2014 was the highest level transit ridership had been, and I believe it was 57 years. But as we noted, it's subsequently shown some declines, and that, of course, has made folks nervous. Here is the ridership trend in millions for both. The blue line is the national total, and the mustard colored line is the state of Florida. And a couple interesting trends. You can see this is rolling 12-month data. You can see the declining trends since about September of 2014 and a little bit earlier for Florida. You'll also notice that Florida appears to be much more sensitive to cyclical fluctuations in the economy than does the national total. And needless to say, this decline creates worry. Transit is known for having this downward cycle where declining ridership results in lost fare revenues, which can then subsequently result in service cutbacks, which further the spiral. And of course, that's the thing that makes the industry nervous, trying to stop that downward spiral from taking place. This data is national data for the 2014 to 2016 period. And as you can see, 40 of the top urban areas across the country are reported here. 34 of them had declining ridership. Only 6 of them had ridership growth. If you add 2017 data to update that, you'd see more of them slip into the negative category over that time period. So this is not unique to some niche properties. This is pretty broad-based: new cities, old cities, east cities, west cities, north, south, etc. No compelling story to be told in terms of which entities were able to avoid the trend based on the national profile. If you look across Florida, Florida had downward trends as well in all but Jacksonville. Of the top 10 agencies, that represents about 87%, 88% of the total ridership in Florida. This data is not inconsistent with some other national commuting trend data. This particular graph shows what's been going on in the various modes of commute to work. Now, this data is exclusive to commuting to work. And as you can see, transit ticked down from its peak of 5.2% mode share in 2015 down to 5.1% in 2016. We'll have a 2017 number in about September of this year. The big growth mode has been work at home, and that showed a real strong uptick in the 15 to 16 time period, and we'll touch on that more later as a potential factor explaining some of the softness in transit ridership. This table and the next one, which is for Florida, are some trend summary data for different time periods for both transportation demand, i.e. ridership, and I apologize, my ridership label on the first block of squares didn't come through, and service miles. And as you look at the top, you can see that over 10 years, the industry still has a positive trend with the exception of bus. But if you look at the 3-year period, we can see that most things have turned negative with the exception of light rail. If you look at a 1-year trend, all of the trends are negative. And this is an enumeration of all of the transit properties in the NTD data set that happen to have full complete data for the reference time periods. Again, these will get updated slightly, so we would expect some modest changes in the next month or two as people modify and tweak their data submissions and incomplete ones get finalized. But the picture is relatively clear. And if you look at the third quarter of the year, and of course we're trying to see if this, what appeared to be a downward deceleration, is starting to stabilize, is what we were interested in. So we did look at a third quarter over third quarter trend. There was a little bit of positive news for heavy rail and demand response in that time frame, but continued soft bus, although not as soft, but increased softening in light rail and streetcar in that period at the national level. And for those folks that have postulated service supply is a factor in the decline in ridership, the bottom set of data suggests that that's absolutely not the case, that at both the 10, 3, and 1 year data sets, we're showing positive increases in service supply across the nation, similar with the quarter over quarter reporting. So service supply is generally up, and ridership is down, and it does not look like we've turned a corner yet in terms of the downward trend. Perhaps we've hit bottom, but there's no evidence of a corner being turned. This graphic is Florida trends, a little bit more mixed and a little bit more sensitive to individual agencies and changes in supply and demand here, but of more troubling concern is this number here, the 7% year-over-year decline. And of course, Florida in 2017 got hit with a month of where service was very limited because of storm recovery and disruptions. Statewide service or ridership was down something like 30 to 40% in the time period surrounding the storms that impacted Florida. So that's wrapped into these numbers as well, but nonetheless, some concerns that Florida trends are more discouraging than national trends. So if we look at what this all means in the 2012 to 2014 period, the industry and stakeholders were pretty pleased. Transit was near a 60-year high. There was still a kind of compelling feeling that millennials were different and more conducive to using transit. Some folks thought we'd passed peak VMT. We were seeing strong growth in urban development, and CBDs were thriving, particularly with new residential. There was a strong commitment of developers to embracing transit in the presence of transit. There was positive success in numerous referendums. And transportation network companies, the Ubers and Lyft of the world, were seen as very positive, complementary first mile, last mile tools that could be positive and helpful to transit. When we start to look at the 15 to 17 period, we're looking at a 3-year plus now, almost 4 years of declining ridership. We're seeing that migration and immigration trends are resuming historic patterns. We're still seeing a movement to the south and the west, and an increasing evidence of a movement back to stronger suburbanization and weaker CBD and core city growth. We're seeing VMT and VMT per capita continue to grow. There's evidence of millennials shifting into more traditional behaviors with car buying ramping up pretty dramatically, and as well as move to the suburbs somewhat later in life than other cohorts, but nonetheless a big share of that cohort is following historically similar behaviors. System conditions in transit have been a concern. We've had reliability issues in a number of properties, healthcare costs hurting agencies, etc. We've had some projects that have been disappointments. The Hawaii rail system, both in terms of timing and price, those kinds of things. Some of the new streetcar and commuter rail projects aren't producing at levels that expected. And there's a recognition that Uber and Lyft while they can complement transit in some cases, there are also some strong evidence in some certain cities and studies that they're cannibalizing transit ridership as well. And we've got an increasing contingent of folks asking about connected and automated vehicles and raising implications about what that'll do to future transit ridership and what the role of transit will be in the future. So we've really reached a kind of a critical point in terms of understanding what's going on with transit ridership. When I analyze ridership, I tend to use a couple of different frameworks, but this is one that I've put together that helps me shape some of our data collection and analysis. We look at the demand side, what's going on in demographics and economics, and then we look at the supply side. And in the supply side, I look both at transit service quality, supply levels, pricing, performance, etc., and then the competition, i.e. Gas prices, availability of alternatives, etc., and use that framework to think about and analyze what might be going on and how we can explain trends and changes in ridership. This is a graphic that was used in a presentation last fall to the Metro Board. That reflects some of the analysis that their staff and our consultant did, and it shows a framework that they use to characterize factors that are influencing transit ridership. And the thing that I find helpful in this one in particular is they were identified things that are within the control of the agencies and those that are external factors beyond at least the immediate control of the agency. And that's a useful characteristic to think about as well when we think about what's influencing transit ridership. When we think about the specific demographic and land use characteristics, there's a number of aspects of that. The population age is highly correlated to transit use. Geographic distributions as it relates to the availability of transit service are important. Geographic distributions within metro areas, again, as it relates to the availability of quality transit service, is a factor. Income, licensure, auto ownership levels collectively, poverty, those are all related to the ability to afford alternatives, etc. APTA has spent some time studying ridership trends as well, and one of their reports and some focus groups that they did suggested that they were seeing some reduced college student ridership, etc. And a related factor to demographics is there's some questions and hypotheses that some core values of the public are changing. Their patience for waiting for things is perhaps influenced by the just-in-time economy and the app-based psychology, etc. And some of these things might be spilling over and having an impact on their propensity and willingness to use public transportation. This particular graphic looks at transit use as a function of age cohort and total travel. The upper left-hand graph represents the total transit or trip making rates as a function of age. The graph below that is transit mode share as a function of age. And the graph on the right-hand side is age cohort distribution. Now in our survey or our seminar in 2 weeks, you'll get a much more detailed presentation of this based on some research that's been carried out that looks at this. But the short message is, as the big baby boom generation moves towards retirement, they're traveling less, and as the millennials move past their peak transit use years, those factors both tend to undermine transit use as population ages, and that can have a negative effect on population or on transit use. This particular table characterizes population growth rates and declines in different areas, and we appended transit commute share from the American Community Survey to the changes in population. And if you look at the left-hand side of the table, those happen to be the 10 counties in the country that grew the most between July of 2015 and July of 2016. And their weighted average mode share for commuting on transit was 3.4%. On the table on the left is the top 10 areas for declining population, and their mode share for use of transit was 7.8%. So needless to say, if we've got people leaving transit-friendly and transit-intensive environments and moving to areas with less transit service and less transit use culture, obviously that undermines and challenges the industry in terms of being able to meet and attract travelers. And again, you'll see more analysis of that in a couple of weeks if you attend that seminar. This graph uses a percent change for transit use in zero vehicle households, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. This is a very significant factor in explaining transit use in our opinion, and also the opinion of some other researchers that have analyzed this in detail as well. But you can see downward trends in terms of vehicle availability, improvements in vehicle availability, and downward trends in transit ridership. This image shows just how significant that vehicle availability is at the household level. For households with zero vehicles available, on average, they make 229 transit trips per year. If the household has one vehicle available, on average, they make 38 transit trips per year. And if they have 2+ vehicles available, they make 10 transit trips per year. And those trip rates are based on 2009 NHTS data. We'll be updating that with 2017 data shortly. But nonetheless, these are historically recognized dramatic differences in household travel behavior as a function of vehicle availability. And if you layer that information with changes in population, you can see some rather dramatic declines in the number of people in zero-car households, and interestingly, even declines in the number of people in one-car households, with dramatic growth in the number of people in two-plus car households. If you multiply that out, this single factor alone at the national level arguably explains something like 53% of the total decline in transit use that's been witnessed over the 2-year period that this data reflects. So very, very powerful factor. We've had declining zero vehicle households, increases in vehicle availability, and that certainly is a significant factor in undermining transit use. Obviously, a host of things contribute to that: income, gas prices, etc. But pretty dramatic information. At the top of this graph in the blue colored font is the U.S. vehicle available data. This is the share of households with no vehicle available from 2007 through 2016. You can see it peaked in 2011 at 9.3% of households. As of 2016, it had declined to 8.7% of households. And Nearly half of all transit trips are made by residents in zero-car households. The 2001 NHTS showed 44.6% from zero-car households. The 2009 NHTS showed 48%. And the newest NHTS, and we have looked at that just yesterday, showed 43% of transit trips nationally originating in zero-car households. So obviously it continues to be a very important component of the transit ridership market. We don't really know a lot about the nature of zero-car households. We don't know what share of those are zero-car based on income constraints, which share are zero-car based on a choice, a personal choice, not a medical, financial, legal, or other constraint, and then what share are zero-car households based on legal or medical type conditions, mental, physical inabilities, etc., that preclude that. We do know that zero-car households range from 4% low in Utah, and it's a pretty uniform trend up to Massachusetts at 12.6% zero-car households. And then, of course, it jumps up for New York and District of Columbia. But again, powerful factors in understanding transit use. This graphic uses percent change to lay transit ridership percent changes on a graph that shows SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or what's commonly known as a food stamp program, levels. And it does a couple things. One, there's a relatively clear correlation in these trends, particularly since about 2010. And two, it raises the issue of most programs designed to provide services to folks based on need celebrate the fact that their services are less in use when the economy improves because it reduces their costs, etc. Transit, unfortunately, while it reduces demand, it hasn't been leveraged to reduce costs, and it also undermines transit's ability to accomplish some of its other goals, like resource efficiency and reduce congestion, improve the environment, etc. So we're not quite the same, but nonetheless, the fact that a lot of folks are no longer needing to be dependent upon public transit has some positive implications as well. There are some other hypothesized demographic considerations, and there was some new evidence just recently. Brookings released a piece earlier this week on suburban growth trend renewal. There's been some speculation that the international immigrants may have a different demographic profile than in the past in terms of levels of education and compensation, etc. There's also speculation that the points of arrival are different than historically, where it tended to be concentrated in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, Seattle, etc. But now there's immigrant populations that are arriving in places like Austin and Charlotte and Atlanta and other areas that are less transit intensive. And there may be some factors there that are playing into transit ridership use. And an individual, when I presented this at APTA, came up to me and talked afterwards about licensure law changes in, I believe, 13 different states, including California, where undocumented immigrants can now get a driver's license, and they were seeing 800,000 additional licenses issued in California after that law change. And that might be enabling more people and spurring more people into auto ownership and undermining transit use as well. So those are some other sociodemographic considerations. This reiterates the issue that I'd raised previously. There's some speculation that perhaps people's core values, independent of changes in the economy and demographics, etc., are there other things that are changing in our value set that make us more or less likely to use transit than we might have historically? And again, that kind of the speculation is that today's culture of immediate gratification doesn't play well with transit, where you're working with a fixed schedule, etc., and people's tolerance of waiting for service, etc., might be different than it was in the past. Obviously, that's something that's difficult to tease out in research work, but certainly an interesting phenomenon. I'll shift here and talk a little bit about service quality. And some of the things that we'll look at, I don't have time to go into all of these, but I'll touch on several of them as we click through some of the following information here. One of the first things that folks ask when you talk about ridership changes is, well, our fare's gone up and has that impacted ridership? And the top line here is per passenger fare adjusted for inflation, and the bottom line is passenger fare per passenger mile. And as you can see, these are relatively flat lines, particularly the per passenger mile. Average trip length has increased, and that's mitigated some of the upward creep in fare prices per trip. The last 2 years we had to shift to a different data source, and because of time lags for data, but we think that the findings are robust. Riders or fare increases, while in an individual property they may be significant, collectively they don't appear to be a factor towards which we can attribute significant influence on ridership. The next series of graphs look at supply and demand for the various modes. This is total fixed route, and you can see the turn in about mid to late 2014 in fixed route ridership, with supply being, supply actually really took its biggest hit early in the recession, has been on a positive upward trend since then. If you look at bus has been hurt the most, with the steepest decline that dates back even further to about 2011 time period. And again, supply, while it did decline during the recession, has been relatively stable through that period. One thing we haven't looked at when we click to the light rail slide, we have added new both light rail, heavy rail, and commuter rail services in a number of communities. Typically, we implement those services in what were previously strong corridors for bus ridership, and I haven't, nor have I seen other evidence that anybody's really gone over and looked at the, how that might be influencing the modal ridership and service supply trends in the industry as we convert some of our better transit corridors into guideway corridors. Light rail had a break as well. It was later, much later than some of the other trends, and obviously a stronger upward supply trend as new projects are implemented. Heavy rail broke earlier in terms of its trend, about 2015, but a kind of a steady positive supply growth, but pretty modest. And commuter rail, similarly positive supply trend, a very soft break, and a relatively recent break in terms of a downward ridership trend. So the premium modes that are used by choice travelers appear to be more immune to the economic effects than the captive travelers and the urban centric markets, in my opinion. I'm going to look a little bit at the competition factors. Again, we won't have time to talk about all of them, but I want to talk about several or a few of them. This is gas price. This is one you see in a lot of media reports. There's a temptation to attribute the trend to gas prices. Certainly gas prices contribute, but the evidence suggests it's relatively modest. And in fact, I would speculate that it's not on the trip decision-making level, but I think gas prices influences both the ability and the desire to own autos, and hence the impact is really shows up in auto ownership, perhaps more so than on mode choice for a given trip, as it relates to gas price. Some conclusions or interpretation here. Ridership trends are very context specific and very significantly across geography. The soft ridership in different communities has different core causes: telecommuting, TNCs, service reliability, auto ownership trends, fares, are different in different markets, and you see that in some of the reporting and news stories and research that has been borne out. We're not moving monolithically at all. Service reliability, for example, is related to system conditions in certain areas, and those can have an important influence. Even things like TNC availability and telecommute propensity varies pretty dramatically across markets. So the factors explaining ridership trends are quite dynamic. It is important to realize that historically transit's had the lowest mode loyalty. It's the mode of last resort, and I don't say that to slur the industry, but if you look at data on NHTS, folks who use transit are least loyal to it and use it fewer days per week and are more likely to use alternative modes when they can. And that shows up in as conditions like the economy change, there is a tendency to lose riderships. There are, of course, some risks if declining fare revenues from ridership declines occur, and if we see dampened public willingness to increase subsidies due to soft ridership, that does, of course, risk that downward spiral that we referenced earlier. This is a graphic that I've pasted together that kind of tries to explain which factors are important based on the economic status of the traveler. And this isn't quantified, but I think that the low to moderate income folks have been dramatically influenced by car availability and affordability in their own economic conditions, perhaps by gas price. They're sensitive to fares. And some of them have been impacted by gentrification and housing affordability. A lot of the strong growth in urban areas has resulted in much higher prices for rent and housing, and it's forced low-income, high transit users to new locations, and I think that's been compounded by public policy in terms of public housing, and I think that's perhaps undermined some of the core historic urban, particularly bus and heavy rail ridership. The higher income folks are more sensitive to and able to take advantage of things like e-commerce and telework, Uber, Lyft, perhaps more sensitive to travel time reliability, service quality, service speed, service availability, premium service in particular. And so each market segment is differentially impacted as conditions change with respect to these variables. This graph is a wild guess graph, so don't quote it, but think about it. In thinking about what's going on, there's really a couple purposes here. This is a pie chart that explains the factors that contribute to the ridership loss, and there's a couple points. One is there's all kinds of different factors. And as I've hinted, increased auto availability, I think, is a huge factor. But there are many other factors, each of which plays a role. Again, these are guesses, but they're informed guesses and they're educated guesses, but they're not quantified guesses. I didn't look at individual properties and weight them and apply, data, etc. I took some guesses at things based on the materials we've looked at and read. A couple of kind of interesting things here. There have been some weather and event factors, not just in Florida, but other parts of the country. Interesting, something as simple as 2016 was a leap year and 2017 wasn't. That means we've got 0.27% less days in 2017. So you would expect 0.27% less transit riders, just attributable to the fact that we've got one less day in 2017. I put parking cost and availability as a zero effect. I put that in there because all kinds of travel demand modeling points out how important parking cost is to mode choice. And we really don't have any data to know if that's changing and if that could have had an effect one way or the other. We do know there were some changes in computer benefit programs. Phil Winters here at the center understands those. Those appear to potentially have impacted some folks in particularly the high-cost commuting markets where they're impacted by that cap. And there's some reference to that in the metro work, etc. I haven't credited them with a significant impact in overall situation. Things like system safety and reliability, personal safety, cleanliness, this issue of homelessness, drug paraphernalia in stations, urine smells, etc. You'll see a fair amount of media awareness of some of the factors in some certain communities that are certainly going to discourage folks from using transit regularly. And so those I don't think are trivial at all as factors that impact ridership. But anyway, something to think about. As we move to talk about some of the implications here, as we continue to have very strong employment and real income growth, we could continue to see transit dependency being undermined and perhaps softening ridership even more. We don't really know what that bottom threshold is in terms of share of the population that will be captive to zero-car households, irrespective of economic conditions, because they're not employable even in a very strong economy. And so we don't know just how much lower or how much more vehicle availability can change going forward. Urban civility may influence future ridership, and that in reference to the trends that we've seen in some cities where there's clearly some problems with maintaining and securing the systems and making them attractive, and that's not a trivial problem in several markets. There's some demographic trends relating to transit-oriented development. There's some evidence that that's pricing high transit use folks out of the market. And while folks choosing that location preference might enjoy the use of transit occasionally, if you're replacing people that are dependent on transit, you may not net out in terms of a positive impact on transit ridership. The growth in VMT has ratcheted up congestion levels on the roadway system. That can certainly favor premium transit services from a time competition perspective, but it'll undermine operations in mixed traffic, and you're seeing that with some slowdowns in service and/or systems having to add extra buses to keep schedule, etc. So that can have a very negative impact on street operations. And again, system condition and quality of industry execution. If we can't get some of the safety issues and other things resolved, there's some real risk to ridership. When we think about this in reflection, there becomes an issue of what do we need to do to reach a tipping point? Is there an inflection point? Why was Seattle, where they've shown not only an increase, but a very meaningful increase in ridership? You know, what's the magic sauce there? And what set of conditions in terms of demographic, economic, service, etc., are enabled them to be, you know, best the national trends. A number of cities or some other cities have done different things with system reconfigurations, etc. And there are some things that we can look at. But again, the challenge is finding situations where we're able to grow transit use proportional to or greater than proportional to the increase in service. And historically, elasticity of demand with respect to supply has been something like 40%, and that's an expensive game to play. We need to find a combination of conditions where things can move in a positive direction. For those of you that are fascinated with transit travel behavior and transit research, I'd encourage you to print this one out and think about it a little bit. The top graph here has some mode share probabilities as a function of the captive and choice markets. And I want to draw your attention to the bottom graph here, the green line. This is hypothesized on my part, but I think one of the challenges to the industry is improving service but still not making it really good isn't enough to trip behavior changes, and that the sensitivity from behavior change perspective for choice travelers really isn't going to occur until service quality gets into the relatively high frequency areas. Again, this is something that I pasted on here. This is obviously variable across contexts and people, but I think it's an important thing to understand. If you're a system and you increase headways from 60 minutes to 40 minutes and expect to see a meaningful bounce in choice travelers, might not happen. You're simply not at the threshold of behavior change. And frankly, we don't really know as much about those behaviors as I wish we did in terms of understanding transit use. As we move to wrap up here, there's several pieces of research that have taken place. There's more and more stories, etc. There's some work underway at Georgia Tech doing a synthesis, and TRB has two major projects that will be looking at transit ridership trends in the near future as well. When you think about how stakeholders should respond, I left that page blank, and I say that facetiously. We will be, for Florida DOT, addressing some both strategic and tactical responses of the industry, and I'll share a couple of thoughts here as we move towards closing. Public transit's historically had three key goals. There are many more, and I recognize that, but predominantly we focus on mobility, resource efficiency, and economic competitiveness. And we might best address that with multiple technologies and services, a mix of public and private providers, and different funding and pricing strategies. So not rocket science here, but I think we need to think a little bit broader. This analogy is today's modal silos will disappear as we move towards new mode choice and business options for mobility. We won't be worrying about transit. We'll be simply worrying about mobility, and transit as we define it and know it today will be real different. We'll still try and meet those same goals, but the mix of solutions that we use will probably change significantly. For more details on the demographic effects, we've got a webinar same time in a couple weeks in April. If you want to keep up on what's going on with technology, this is a new book that was released recently. Dan Sperling edited it. I authored the chapter with him as a co-author, Chapter 5 on public transportation. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Finally, Cutter hosts the Journal of Public Transportation, and we've done an issue that was in effect the retirement issue for Joel Valinsky, our previous National Center for Research Director, and that journal has 14 different papers that speak to the future of public transportation by some names that many of you will recognize on the left-hand column that were the authors of those papers. All but I think one or two of those are posted at that link now. The others will be available shortly. I authored one as well. And if you speculating and thinking about the future of transit and the things that are going on in the industry and how the industry needs to respond, I think this will give you some real good reading by some bright and insightful folks that will help you think about how stakeholders in public transportation respond to the changes that we're witnessing now and that we're likely to see in the future. And with that, I'll conclude my prepared remarks and turn my attention to some questions that Jody can throw at me here.
Okay, Steve, it's Stephanie. I'm going to cut in before Jody takes it away. I would just like to remind you how to ask questions using the Q&A box located on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in your question and or comment, and then we'll read them aloud. So Jody, you want to take it away? I know we have a few already.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie. And just as a reminder, any questions that we don't get to, we will do our best to reply via your email if that address was provided. So the first question that came in is a comment and question. One of the audience members mentioned that service frequency and or number of trips offered might be equally important in determining supply. So do you think service miles is an adequate summary of service supply?
You know, it's a measure that's available through NTD. The two kind of measures that you have in data sets are miles and hours of service. And so that we're really kind of captive to that. We could do transit trips, but I don't think that you've got a geographic coverage aspect and a temporal coverage of aspect. So I think vehicle miles is the best aggregate measure of service availability to use for this type of macro analysis. At a more micro geographic specific level, you might want to look at a number of different measures.
Thank you. The next question that came in was, did you look at the impact of dependence? And I think that was specifically focused on, oh, I lost the slide number that I had typed.
In the context of household composition or transit captives? Do you have any sense? In general, you know, I talked a fair amount about the term captive, and I know the industry gets squeamish about that, and the reality is there's no definitive definition of what constitutes being captive. But generally, those households that don't have a vehicle, personal vehicle choice, have a real different propensity to use transit. So I tend to focus on that group. The household composition of zero vehicle households is also relevant. We haven't looked at that specifically yet, but as auto ownership increases, the characteristics of the zero vehicle household get more stark in terms of more single person households, etc., more seniors and folks that don't have vehicles in those households. So we can't enumerate that completely at this point in time, but we do have a good sense of what's
Yeah, I
going
got some
on.
clarification that that question was specifically on the impacts of transit riderships related to the pie chart, and I think that your response answered that question. And so we have another. It seems like Florida ridership trends are similar to the US, only more aggregated. Why do you suppose this is?
Yeah, more exaggerated, and they are, and my thinking is that transit levels of service in Florida are modest, is kind of a polite way of saying it, and partly because simply our development patterns aren't conducive to strong transit markets that justify high quality or high frequency services, perhaps with the exception of Southeast Florida and some limited specific corridors. So a lot of Florida transit users are folks that use it when they have to. And as the economy improves and they can find a way not to use transit, they do. In other parts of the country, the New York, Chicago's, Washingtons, there's transit has some premium services to CBDs with $20 and $30 parking costs. And those are choice travelers. Those aren't folks using it because they have to. They're using it because it makes sense in their context. I think we have less of those folks. So I think we've historically been more sensitive to the economy. Our service quality is such that if people can find an alternative means, they do. And I think that's perhaps why Florida is a little different than the national
Okay, and I think
trends.
we'll squeeze in one last question. Do you think the emergence of micro transit has had an impact, positive or negative, on public transit ridership?
I don't think it's been meaningful at all yet. That doesn't mean it might not have potential in the future, but it's simply not deployed at a scale to be significant in the context of total transit use. Even Uber and Lyft, we're looking at Uber and Lyft being, maybe a 0.5% mode share, generally concentrated in the larger urban areas. And it's real hard to tease out effects of some of these new and emerging phenomenon in terms of the totality of their impact. We simply don't have the data, and the measurement issues get pretty complex when you're talking about fractions of percents.
Okay, with 40 seconds left, Steph, can I ask one more or are we done?
Well,
No, go
let me
ahead, ask one
remind
more.
folks, this is recorded, so if there's colleagues of yours that you think would benefit from it, in a few days it'll be available online. You can share that link, and the PDF of the presentation can be downloaded as well, and certainly take advantage of that. That's the business we're in, of disseminating information, so we
Okay,
hope to
so
do that.
And Jody, real
go
quick
ahead.
before you wait, Jody, real quick before you ask the last question, I'm going to just open up. I know a few people are starting to uh, close the webinar, but if you could just take a few moments to complete the evaluation that I have just opened up, it provides us a lot of great feedback for not only this session, but the Cutter webcast in general. So we'll take one more question before we close
So with
today's
ridership
webinar.
and
Go ahead,
marketing
Jody.
efforts often spoke in the same sentence, have you seen any correlation between marketing efforts and ridership trends? Are there certain types of marketing that are seen to be more promising than others?
I do think that there have been studies, research in the past about marketing strategies for public transportation. There was actually an online article just today that talked about strategies for influencing ridership behavior. In the context, this happened to be about LA. I'm not aware of what the quantified impacts of various marketing strategies are on transit. And of course, it really depends on the context as well. You need a good product to advertise to attract folks to. informational advertising, making people aware of service and options is kind of a first step for the industry, and then perhaps some cultural and other behavioral encouragement added. Marketing can complement that, but marketing is expensive, and oftentimes agencies have a choice of, do we market or do we put service on the street, and that's a trade-off that individual agencies have to make.
Okay. Thank you, Steve.
Okay,
And
well, thank you very much for your time out of your day, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jody, so much. We will be back on Thursday, April 12th, for another great webinar, Understanding the Effects of Demographic and Socioeconomic Factors on Public Transit Ridership Trends, by one of our graduate students, Kurt Lehman. Again, thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and if you could take a few moments to complete the evaluation that I have opened. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.